the U.S. government has heard from President Moon, but all of that has to be verified by the United States, and that has to occur through direct contact.
He instructed Secretary Pompeo to not get into the time game.
That it's almost an invitation to the North Koreans to drag this process out. I would not want them to signal publicly the level of patience.
The commitment to inspectors, that's essential in order to achieve denuclearization, but at the same time, that what the U.S. has really wanted is a comprehensive declaration.
The real risk here is that through the access of inspectors, which is being set by North Korea.
He does run the risk of being an advocate for Kim Jong-un. We think that Kim Jong-un has not yet committed to denuclearization.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will travel to Pyongyang in October to lay the groundwork for a second summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim. Only a month ago, the Secretary's trip to Pyongyang had been abruptly canceled. So what has changed since then?
The United States continues to engage with North Korea to implement the commitments made in Singapore.
I just showed a letter that I received just yesterday from Chairman Kim.
Now my guest today, Mr. Frank Jannuzi, President of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Also joining us today, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Snyder worked as an Asia specialist in many think tanks for more than 20 years. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Now, President Trump canceled Secretary Pompeo's trip a month ago, abruptly canceled it, citing a lack of progress. So now that Secretary is traveling to Pyongyang, it must mean that there's a reason to believe that this trip will be successful. So what do you think North Korea guaranteed to the United States?
I don't think that we know exactly what North Korea guaranteed, but I think that it's clear that President Moon's visit to Pyongyang elicited, first of all, an additional commitment by Kim Jong-un to the concept of denuclearization, and of course also some commitments to inspections of the missile site and possibly Yongbyon. And now we have to follow up and find out whether indeed on the U.S. side we can also confirm North Korea's commitment to denuclearization and accompanying concrete steps in that direction.
Now, in the past couple of weeks, the leaders of the two Koreas and then the leaders of South Korea and the United States had met. And President Trump said, you'd be surprised looking at what's going on behind the scenes. So do you think there was some kind of a closed-door agreement on what U.S. and North Korea will give and take? And do you think the parties involved share more mutual understanding now than before?
Well, I certainly am impressed by the intensity of the collaborative efforts between the United States and Seoul. I think the United States in recent months has been making intensive efforts to strengthen the dialogue channels from the highest levels of the U.S. government to President Moon. You've got Steve Biegun making trips, you've got Mark Lambert from the State Department making trips, you've got Pompeo very active in the region. And I just get a sense that there's an awful lot going on in terms of coordination. And I think that one of the reasons why the Pompeo visit is back on to Pyongyang is because there was close consultation between Washington and Seoul about the summit meeting between President Moon and President Kim, and I suspect that Washington was not surprised by any of the outcomes of that meeting, and that's a good thing for the diplomacy.
We definitely shouldn't be surprised by anything that happened in Pyongyang. I do think that there might have been some areas where we were a little bit surprised, especially on the military aspects of the agreement to implement the Panmunjom Summit Declaration.
So what was not in the Pyongyang Declaration but was later explained by Seoul to Washington was that North Korea will accept IAEA and U.S. inspectors. Now, was this explanation by Seoul meaningful or useful in moving the process forward?
I think it's complicated because the commitment to inspectors is a step forward, a tangible step forward toward a possible verification process, and that's essential in order to achieve denuclearization. But at the same time, it seems that what the U.S. has really wanted is a comprehensive declaration of North Korean materials and facilities, and the steps that North Korea took in the context of the Pyongyang summit fall far short of that.
I think Scott makes a good point. The real risk here is that the United States is setting up a norm with respect to the access of inspectors, their ability to do their jobs, which is being set by North Korea. So once the United States begins a observation, inspection, monitoring process, it's going to be hard for the United States down the road to demand a higher level of transparency, a higher level of access. Will these inspectors be able to bring technical equipment with them of their own, or will they be depending on the North Koreans? Will they be able to travel outside of the geographic boundaries that the North Koreans set for them when they are invited to come monitor activities at Yongbyon? I don't believe that these questions have been answered yet, and there is some risk that once we begin an inspection process using North Korea's rules, that it's going to be awfully hard to reset the rules down the road.
Frank just mentioned that U.S. is now following norms set by North Korea. Now, on that point, President Moon is saying so much more than what's actually on the agreement. President Moon says that when North Korea says complete denuclearization, that's the same as CVID. He also said that right after the summit, he said observation of experts, permanent dismantling is the same meaning as verifiable and irreversible. So clearly, President Moon's interpretation and subsequent U.S. understanding is much more than what's actually on the declaration. So is there any danger in reading between the lines?
I think that we've made a step forward, and a lot of what President Moon is doing is trying to reframe some of the things that we want from North Korea, maybe in language that is slightly different from their traditional language, because some of that language has taken on particular political meanings. But at the same time, it's going to be necessary to nail down exactly what those terms mean, and I hope that President Moon was able to do that effectively in his conversations with Kim Jong-un.
I was always, frankly, deeply uncomfortable with the concept of irreversibility, because the scientists will tell you that that's not achievable. You can completely eradicate a program, take apart every brick of every building, and those buildings can be reconstructed 20 years from now, unless you're talking about somehow, killing every nuclear scientist in North Korea, every engineer. There's no such thing as irreversible denuclearization. So I think by dropping that jargon, the United States and North Korea actually are taking a step toward a more practical, enforceable commitment to denuclearization. So I think, as Scott says, we need to make sure that we define the terms that we're using the same way. But I've got no problem with President Moon taking that CVID term out of his lexicon.
Mm-hmm. Still, U.S. government's policy goal is CVID, and that is now being expressed as final and fully verified denuclearization. Now, since these terminology is very murky and we're still proceeding with the diplomatic process, is there any fears that U.S. may be lowering the bar and maybe stepping back from demanding the full and final verified denuclearization from North Korea?
Not as a final objective, I don't think. I think it's pretty clear that we need something like complete denuclearization of North Korea, however that might also be defined. But right now we are trying to figure out how to start a process with North Korea. And that's a real challenge because there's risk in trying to insist on a complete declaration on the front end. At the same time, there is risk in allowing North Korea to set the tone by identifying initial steps and trying to take a few bites out of the apple without allowing us to make sure that the entire apple is eaten. And so I think there's a lot of complexity and actually real challenge in terms of figuring out how to interact with North Korea in a productive way given the overall level of distrust between the two sides.
President Trump recently said that he instructed Secretary Pompeo to not get into the time game, that it doesn't matter if it's 2 years or 3 years or 5 months. What is your take on this? Has he shifted his position?
Well, it's a remarkable transformation that President Trump has undergone over the last 2 years with respect to his handling of the North Korea challenge. You know, we went from a very absolutist statements about it won't happen, you know, North Korea will not be allowed to develop ICBM technology, to the end of strategic patience, implying that the Trump administration would move with great alacrity and immediacy and urgency to disarm North Korea, you know, in a matter of months or weeks, to a open-ended process, one which I think is much more in touch with reality than the previous Trump administration position, but it's a little bit disconcerting to see such a 180-degree shift in the rhetoric. And by now saying that we're just going to be very patient, there's a danger that it's almost an invitation to the North Koreans to drag this process out. So I would like the Trump administration to be patient, but I would not want them to signal publicly the level of patience that they are now signaling.
Yeah, very well said.
We've been expecting the second round of summit between U.S. and North Korea to be held in October, but Secretary Pompeo said that will likely come after October. So why do you think this is coming after October?
We've got a lot of work to do to get this process back on track, and I think that the U.S. government has heard from President Moon about what he thinks was accomplished at the Pyongyang summit, but you know, all of that has to be verified by the United States, and that has to occur through direct contact between Secretary Pompeo and Kim Jong-un, and then we also have to follow our coordination processes around that as a means by which to prepare for a second summit.
And I think the political calendar may also play a role. The president intends to be on the stump for Republican candidates between now and the election in November.
Scott, South Korean President Moon Jae-in delivered a speech at the Council on Foreign Relations, and you were also there when he delivered the speech. And one of the attendants said that President Moon seemed determined to represent Kim Jong-un in only the most favorable light. And one U.S. media also said that President Moon is as good as a spokesperson for Kim Jong-un at the United Nations. So how did you see his speech?
Well, I think that the speech was actually a little bit more complicated than that because President Moon also was trying to reaffirm the importance of the alliance. And he actually indicated in that speech and also in his interview with Fox News that the alliance was going to last beyond whatever happens with North Korea. But I think that President Moon is in a very complicated situation right now because he does run the risk of being an advocate for Kim Jong-un to the extent that he thinks that Kim has already committed to denuclearization. And yet we think that Kim Jong-un has not yet committed to denuclearization. And so that's where I think the big challenge lies in terms of a rift between the U.S. and South Korea.
We'll leave it here and watch video for our next discussion.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. I would like to thank Chairman Kim for his courage and for the steps he has taken.
A lot has changed from a year ago when President Trump called Chairman Kim a rocket man and said the U.S. would totally destroy North Korea if necessary. This week, President Trump returned to the UN General Assembly and said the U.S. is seeking a bold and new push for peace with North Korea. Now, President Trump's UNGA speech was starkly different from a year ago. So from the war of words to now the summit diplomacy, during those 1 year, what do you think was the most biggest achievements for the Trump administration in the North Korea policy?
I think they successfully took an intensive sanctions regime, a North Korean leader who was looking to reorient his priorities from security towards economic development, and a South Korean president who was committed to engagement. I think the Trump administration successfully looked at those three conditions and pivoted eventually from the pressure campaign to engagement, and they've done so rather skillfully. So they now have set the stage for what could be constructive diplomacy and meaningful progress towards peace and denuclearization. I think they've done this, and along the way, they have chosen to drop a lot of harsh rhetoric about the murderers in Pyongyang, the attacks on the leader of North Korea. And this has created political space for the North Koreans to reciprocate the engagement efforts. But I think that we should remain somewhat cautious about celebrating the diplomatic initiatives that are underway, because so far they have not yielded any meaningful steps toward denuclearization. And the real crux of this is going to come when the United States begins to insist on serious steps towards denuclearization, and we're not there yet.
Secretary Pompeo said we're facing an unprecedented diplomatic opening. Do you agree?
Well, that's what we're testing, and I think that we just don't know. I think that in Singapore, President Trump was right to meet the decision maker, but he didn't get the decision. And we're trying, I think, to follow up and try to get that decision. And the question really is, how long do we wait? It may be that Kim Jong-un has gone into this process not intending to make a decision at all. But then, is it possible that we can bind him to the process in such a way that the outcome that we want is achieved, even if it is not the outcome that he intends?
And I think Secretary Pompeo frankly misspoke. It's not unprecedented. I think that the Clinton-Jong Myung-nak meeting in Washington, followed up by the Albright meeting in Pyongyang, held similar promise. Not identical, but similar promise to this moment that we are in today. And we squandered it. And the North Koreans helped to sabotage it in their own way as well, but it was largely on the American side. So I think that we need to be cautious and not blow this opportunity. It is a real opportunity.
I want to hear from both of you. So is President Trump more successful than President Obama's strategic patience policy?
It remains to be seen. I mean, I think that he has an opportunity to be more successful than President Obama was with strategic patience. And I think the key to that has actually been the engagement with Kim Jong-un directly. But so far it hasn't yielded the fruit that we desire. And so if it doesn't yield fruit, then it's not going to be that much different from what Obama did.
I think it's an unanswerable question because the two presidents were handed different North Koreas. Arguably, President Obama's patience is what created the opportunity for Trump today. So I think Obama deserves credit for not getting us in a war. Trump deserves credit for seizing an opportunity for diplomacy that has presented itself.
We'll end this conversation here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a photo of students at Pyongyang Teachers University. The students are wearing virtual reality goggles during a science class. Frank, what is your reaction?
I bet you those are Samsung phones in those goggles. Probably a sanctions violation. But you know, North Korea wants to be a modern country, and it's stunning that they would be showcasing some of the advanced technology that's out there in a school in Pyongyang. So I'm surprised to see this.
Scott?
I agree that the effectiveness of sanctions is on display right here in this picture. And I can't help but wonder about the idea of virtual reality and North Korea coming together in some strange way.
Are they living in a virtual reality, do you think?
I think that North Korea they're voyeurs on the world, and now we have indications that maybe they want to join it.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Scott, Frank, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Yoon Jung.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Thank you for joining us, and we expect to see you next week.